In this video, we're going to look at the causes of climate change and what the effects of climate change are, what peer-reviewed evidence is and how we use it, what a carbon footprint is, how we can reduce our carbon footprints, and the problems associated with doing that. So as we can see from the graph, the temperature on the Earth has, on average, been increasing over the past 150 years or so. Now, most scientists agree that this is caused by greenhouse gases. We can see how the concentration of the greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide, increases at broadly the same rate as the global temperature. This is because, as we increase the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, that means we're going to have more of the greenhouse effect, which we looked at in the previous video. So if you're not sure what that is, just go back to that video to recap it. And most scientists agree that this is caused by humans putting more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Now, when we're talking about scientists agreeing what the cause of things like global warming is, the evidence they produce is something called peer-reviewed. This means it has been checked by other scientists before it's been published. This makes it more reliable because you know that other scientists agree with the findings and are able to reproduce the results. If a scientist published a piece of work which wasn't peer-reviewed, you might not be able to trust it as much because you don't know if other people agree with it. So the reason we've got a high degree of confidence that the amount of greenhouse gases is causing climate change is because multiple scientists all agree with it. That evidence has been peer-reviewed. The Earth's atmosphere is really complex. This means it's really difficult to produce a model to predict what's going to be happening in the future with the atmosphere. So you know how hard it is to predict what the weather's going to be like over the next week, let alone trying to predict what's going to happen to the amount of carbon dioxide and the effect that will have in global warming in a year or two's time. So because of how complicated the atmosphere is, we can maybe have a broad model and we can predict in the general trends what might happen, but it's very difficult to predict exactly what's going to happen as a result of global warming. We're now going to look at what the effects of climate change are. Now, all of these effects are ultimately caused by an increased temperature. So because of global warming and the greenhouse effect, the overall, on average, the temperature of the Earth is increasing. Now, it doesn't mean that everywhere across the Earth gets hotter. It might have more an impact in some places than others, and it can cause some parts of the world to get colder. We're going to look at 4 specific effects, though, of climate change. All of these effects link together, so you've got to be able to explain the sequence of events as we go through. So if we increase the temperature, this is going to cause the ice caps to melt. So if the ice caps melt, this will cause sea levels to rise. And if sea levels rise, it can cause flooding in coastal areas. So again, it's really important to explain the linked chain of events. You can't just say that, for example, if you're answering an exam question, that one of the effects of climate change is that flooding happens. You've got to talk through the entire process. So for example, one of the effects of climate change is that the increased temperature causes the ice caps to melt. When the ice caps melt, the sea levels rise, and this means you're going to get flooding in coastal areas. You've got to explain the entire process. You can't just skip straight to the end result. The changing of the Earth's climate can also cause a change in the amount of rainfall different areas have. So if this means rainfall in certain areas is reduced, it can cause us to have droughts in those areas, or if there's an increased amount of rainfall in those areas, it can cause flooding. So these can cause some regions to get too much or too little water. This, along with any changes in temperature, could affect the ability of those areas to produce food, so you can have a big knock-on effect in terms of food production. The temperature of part of the sea or different areas of land can change as well. This can cause species to go extinct. It doesn't take a big temperature change to cause certain species to die out, Particularly some marine animals and corals are very sensitive to temperature changes. A temperature change of just a couple of degrees can cause some species to die out. Finally, this can also cause the frequency and severity of storms to change, so we could get storms at a higher frequency and they could be more damaging. And this can damage buildings, or in extreme cases, cause the loss of life. Again, it's really important to remember whenever you're explaining the effect of climate change, you work your way through the linked effects. You can't just skip to the end, you've got to explain the sequence. When it comes to assessing the risks posed by the consequences of climate change, there are two things which we need to consider. So for example, flooding around coastal areas would affect less people than food production, which could have more of a global impact. And then you need to look at how severe the effects are. So flooding could have a lot more of a permanent and long-lasting effect than storms or severe weather, which might have a shorter-term effect. A carbon footprint is the measure of the amount of carbon dioxide released over the full life cycle of an object, service, or event. So an object, for example, could be a toaster. How much carbon dioxide was released during the manufacture of the toaster, during the transport of it, during its use, and then when it's disposed. A service could be something like the school bus service. So how much carbon dioxide is released over the duration that bus service runs. So an event could be something like the Olympics. How much carbon dioxide was released during the building of all the stadiums, during all of the transport of the athletes and the spectators, and anything that took place during the event as well. We're now going to look at some of the ways which we can reduce carbon footprints. So we know that burning fossil fuels releases carbon dioxide. Instead, we can use renewable energy sources like wind or solar because they don't release carbon dioxide during the production of those types of electricity. We can use processes which are more energy efficient. This means they'll waste less energy, so we'll need to burn less fossil fuels in the first place to produce that energy. We can encourage people and businesses to change their habits. One way the government does this is by taxing businesses based on how much waste they send to landfill. So obviously the businesses will want to avoid having to pay more money, so they'll be encouraged to recycle instead. We can also use new technologies. So an example of this is carbon capture and storage, and it aims to capture the carbon dioxide released from processes such as fossil fuels before it can be released into the atmosphere, and then it can be stored. So if it's not entering the atmosphere, it's not going to cause more of the greenhouse effect. There are a few problems though with trying to reduce carbon footprints using these methods. If the government was to tax companies for the amount of waste they sent to landfill, this could stop economic growth. The companies might not be able to recycle that material, or it might be cheaper for them to pay the tax rather than recycle it. So it wouldn't be reducing the amount of waste, it would just be costing the company money, which would affect the country's overall economic growth. So the government might not want to tax it for that reason. It can be expensive for companies to reduce their carbon footprint. So whilst it might be better for the environment to make these changes, there could be no value to them for spending all that money. So sometimes it's not in their interest to make these changes. And finally, whilst we can all make small changes by using more environmentally friendly items, it needs a lot of people to make those same changes to have a big enough impact, and getting lots of people to make those changes can be really difficult.